The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
LinkedIn presents.
I think back now to how my parents would talk to me. And one of the things they would say to me all the time is, you run so fast to the answer that sometimes you need to be patient and wait for everyone else to catch up to it rather than telling them what the answer is. I think that's really true. And where it's a positive for me is when I'm given opportunities, I can structure systems fairly quickly. And where it shows up negatively and where I've had to learn is that I have to bring people with me.
I'm Maura Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work, and how we can all do both better. I have something in common with today's guest. We both keep Post-it notes scattered around our desks. For both of us, these can be helpful reminders about not getting stuck in negative thought traps and nudges when our personal tendencies might get in the way of more helpful interactions at work. I have one that says, think before you speak. These aren't the only tools that Clayton Lord has built up in his career. Clay is the program director of the SHRM Foundation, and he's also a neurodivergent leader. He's on the autism spectrum. And I can testify firsthand that Clay's brain can create insight and order out of some pretty complex and messy systems. At the same time, he admits that his autism means he doesn't always notice or feel compelled to engage interpersonally in ways that are more typically acceptable at work. So over the years, he's built a robust suite of these tools to help him react and respond in ways that feel more comfortable for neurotypical people. I know what you're thinking. This is called masking, something that neurodivergent people do to conform in a lot of environments. And as Clay acknowledges, this can be exhausting and frustrating. But he also approaches these tools as an important piece of his leadership. And when you come to think about it, much of what we do and learn to be as managers doesn't feel natural to us. We build new muscles and we try different pieces of identity on for size. I don't think Clay sees it much differently. Leadership is a practice, and I learned a lot from how Clay has built his leadership practice over the decades. One of the things that I really wanted to have you on to talk about that I felt like would be so good for the audience was you are on the autism spectrum, and you have really figured out how to work.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I hope that's true.
Well, I don't manage you, so maybe you haven't. but it seemed to me in talking to you that, one of the things I really like to help people think about is, how do I structure my day? How do I do more of what I'm good at and less of what I'm either not so great at or I just don't enjoy?
Yeah.
So I want to touch on that a little bit. But first, I want to hear your story of when you got diagnosed and what it felt like and how you've integrated it into your work life.
So I'm 43 now. So I think the first thing to say is that I have not gone through a full autism diagnosis, in large part because it's quite expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And also because when I was engaged with my therapist, who is the one who sort of talked me through and sort of listened to some of the sort of ways that I experienced the world, she basically was like, so I think it's pretty clear that you're on the spectrum, and you can certainly go get officially tested if you want to, but honestly, it would mostly be for you at this point. So, do what you will.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about that was that was only about 2 years ago. And so, for my entire life, I have navigated a world that has sometimes felt very confusing to me. I tend to be very direct, perhaps overly direct to some people. I tend to show my enthusiasm in ways that can sometimes feel very sort of critical and overbearing to people. I tend to like overtalk and overshare and have a sort of sense of humor that sometimes isn't funny to people and can verge towards sort of being insulting, etc. And I just thought that was me, which of course it is me, but I just thought it was me and my kind of inherent personality. And about 2 years ago now, I was laid off from a job during a restructuring and was very, very angry about that, as you might imagine, but for a lot of different reasons, including that I'd really tied up a lot of who I was in my professional success because that was where I had been sort of the most naturally successful. I have very happy life in all aspects and I'm happily married and all of that, but I found a lot of my worth in my work.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got laid off from my job, I had all these feelings that I didn't know where to put them. And my husband strongly encouraged me to go find a therapist because he was being as supportive as he could be, but he's not trained as a therapist. And these were feelings that were much bigger than I think the two of us together could handle.
Hmm.
And in the course of that, I went through a lot of things. I got a lot of great out of it, a lot of great lessons out of it, a lot of good generally out of it. But in the course of that, we also talked a lot about the way that I have navigated the world and some of the tips and tricks that I have been given by different managers and executive coaches and friends over time that I had just sort of taken as tips and tricks that they were sharing with everyone, but that it turns out are sort of pretty specifically useful to me as someone who doesn't always think about some of the social graces, doesn't always think about the humanity of other people and how that plays out for them because I get so focused on the work.
Can you share a couple?
Oh, sure. The two that I really use on a daily basis, one was given to me by an executive coach probably 15 years ago now. And I guess as a quick aside, I was really, really lucky to have a manager who, despite me being a real mess when it came to managing people when she first hired me, chose to invest in me rather than sort of making that a chronic problem or removing me from my job. And so I had the benefit of accessing an executive coach for about 10 years.
Wow.
But one of the things this coach talked to me about as we were talking through different things, and I'm sure getting a little bit of background from my boss, he sort of figured out that I sometimes was struggling to have interpersonal relationships with people who I was working with. And he pinpointed that one of the reasons that was true is that I never stopped talking about work with them, which of course is quite annoying. And so he advised me to think about one of those little tiny hourglasses. And eventually he actually gifted me a real one that does about a minute. It's not very long, right? But it does about a minute. And what he encouraged me to do was whenever I was in a meeting where I was leading, on a one-on-one situation where it wasn't going to be super weird, to flip that hourglass over. And until the hourglass had run through with sand, I wasn't allowed to talk about work.
Huh.
I wasn't allowed to talk about the purpose of the meeting. I wasn't allowed to ask anything about the professional stuff that was going on. I needed to find something to talk to them about that didn't have anything to do with work, which I found very awkward at the beginning.
Yeah.
And at the same time, ended up reaping a lot of benefits from because it sets up a dynamic where the person can sort of ease into the conversation with you and whatever. And I use it to this day. I try to make sure that for every single one of my check-ins with all the people that I manage, I start out, it can be really simple, asking them how their day's going or, making a note of whatever the thing was that we talked about the previous week that was going on and checking in on that. And I still have moments where I feel awkward about the fact that I have to plan to do that. But at this point, I've sort of embraced that that's the way that I am. And it's not that I find it uninteresting. I actually really like the conversations as they happen. I just don't naturally think of them. So at SHRM, they've implemented a product called Culture Amp, which is sort of like evaluation and check-in software. And so I use that and I use it with all of my direct reports. And on a weekly basis, I ask them to complete what takes them about 2 minutes. to fill in any work-related items that they want to talk to me about during the check-in, but then also to use some barometers that are built into Culture Amp about their personal well-being, about how they're feeling about their workload, about, their stress level, generally speaking. And that's helpful because I'm a pretty analytical person. And so I can look at those and see if there's an issue. And also because Culture Amp has this really fantastic thing built in where it automatically warns you if someone's scores on those dip from week to week, so that you can sort of preemptively say, oh, it looks like this person's under stress this week in this way. And you can focus some energy on that, which is something that helps me because that's not where my brain is naturally. I can be deeply empathetic in certain ways, but sort of like personal stress is not really it unless they are very obviously very stressed.
Wow. When you heard from the therapist, I think you're on the spectrum, how did that feel?
Part of me felt really intrigued, I guess. So that was just a couple years ago. So not too far in the past. And at that point, I think some of the shifts that we started to see around embracing neurodivergence as a strength had started to come into the world of work. And so, it was an interesting sort of relatively positive reaction, I think. I struggled then, and I struggle even now a little bit with the idea that it sort of is an excuse for problematic behavior on my part that I actually need to work on instead of just sort of embracing that, like, yeah, this is the way my neurodivergence shows up.
Wait, say more about that.
So some of the ways that my neurodivergence shows up, and I should say that on the scale of the spectrum, I am not terribly far along it. So
Yeah.
I am very high functioning. For me, growing up, I struggled a lot with interpersonal relationships. I had a lot of trouble with friends, which is something that carried into my adult life in various ways, in that I am not naturally very good at navigating the nuances of a friend relationship or a colleague, relationships in general. So
that's a pretty strong statement to say that I'm not naturally very good at navigating the nuances.
Well, and I don't know. I mean, what I will say, my therapist had me write down a bunch of things on Post-its that I still keep by my desk. And one of them, which I'm reading right now, says, stop comparing yourself negatively to other people. So like, I think it's actually par for the course for me that the way I think about things is relatively black and white. I tend to be quite hard on myself. And I also tend to be relatively black and white with other people. So it can create circumstances where I don't have the nuance in what I'm saying for the other person to understand the nuance of what I mean. And so, for example, a work example. So I was managing someone who was really a very good employee. She was a quite good employee. She was sort of young and was still navigating how to be in the world of work, etc. But she was put in charge of a major technology development project that we were working on. And she scheduled a meeting, and she hadn't really talked to me about it in increments at all. And so she scheduled a meeting, and in this meeting, she gave this big old presentation, which was a good first try at the project. But she was also, this was the first time that she'd done something like this. And so it wasn't perfect. There were lots of things that sort of needed to be improved on it. But I was really excited about it, and I was really enthusiastic. And the way that I expressed that enthusiasm was I went back to my desk and I wrote up a 2-page list of all of the things that I was really excited about improving on this project. And she wrote back a very thoughtful, but also very direct email to me about how that had made her feel. And it was devastating. Like, it was, I had to go home. I couldn't handle how upset she was. From what she said in her email, she felt none of the enthusiasm that I had. She felt like I was essentially attacking her with criticism. And I mean, like, at 43, I have managed a lot of this into sort of at least mostly submission. But I constantly have to stop myself from providing more feedback or more critique than someone's looking for.
Oh, God, me too. Ugh.
My husband has set me up with a conversation that he and I have whenever we're doing something, which is, are you looking for criticism or are you looking for support? And it's really important that we have that conversation at the start, because otherwise I almost invariably will get it wrong. And that is true in the work environment too, although I tend, rather than expressly asking that, I tend to assume that people are almost always not looking for the fullness of what I can bring when I focus my energy and my intellect on something in terms of like overhaul or editing or whatever.
Clay, I often feel like my passion and hunger and like desire to make things better is how I show I care, but most people interpret it as me being a total pain in the ass. I'm not on the spectrum, but I definitely have my own neurodivergence. But it's so interesting that you bring that up. It's like, but we could spend hours making this better, and here's what we could do, X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's not what people need or want.
Well, and I think that's right. And then I think the other part of this that is really true for me, and like I just had something happen today where luckily we're now at the point where my boss and I both have sort of harnessed some of my peculiarities for good.
Mm-hmm.
But like my boss asked me to look at a document that is going out to a bunch of important people. And the reason she asked me to look at it, even though it's probably not something that at my level I should be spending an hour doing, is because she knew that I would catch things in the document that the 4 other people who had worked on the document before that hadn't.
Mm.
And I know from to the moments when she asks me to do this, that is a moment where she is looking for me to bring the full brunt of my critical eye.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do everything. I go into formatting. I cross-check times. I make sure that you know all of the look and feel is the same. That everything's color coded. That whatever. And it's a really joyful, fun experience for me. But it's also really important that the way that went is that my boss asked me to do it, and I just sent it straight back to her. So the people who originally worked on it, they don't know that I've worked on it, because that's when it can get offensive, because it feels like, well, why didn't you just ask me to refine this? Which is very real, except that document needed to go out today and they'd been given opportunities to refine it. And my boss made the choice that now she just needed me to look at it, that sort of thing.
When you feel like you're, masking is a term that we're hearing more and more. When you feel like you're sort of holding back, or you said that you've sort of managed it out of yourself after so many years working with people, does that feel effortful or like you're masking, or does it feel like a skill you've learned to get ahead and be better at your job?
I mean, I guess I would say it's both, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, here's an example. I reread basically every email that I write at least 3 times
Mm-hmm.
before I send it, because I am so aware of tonal issues that I can bring into emails. And particularly if I have any sort of contentious relationship with whoever I'm emailing, that I know I need to be extremely careful. And what I think of as overly effervescent in my communications, or I come off quite negative, more negative than I usually am. And it can create all sorts of interpersonal dynamics. And one of the things is also, I didn't always have the self-control to do that, because I also just generally am not a super patient person. So I would navigate things in the aftermath by apologizing, as opposed to proactively navigating them. And in a work setting, that can be hard, and particularly hard over time. So you end up in situations where you're chipping away at relationships and you don't even know it, because of something as simple as like tonal challenges in email. So I will never be the type of person who is what I think of as naturally bubbly and effervescent, right? And what other people think of as relatively normal in their email style. And so I have to try, or it doesn't work. And that's true in other ways too. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to say things like this, but like, I don't naturally think I would ask a lot about the personal lives of my staff. And actually, some of them appreciate that I don't dig into their,
Yeah.
but others of them, I have learned that they are looking for a more personal relationship and interpersonal dialogue. And so I try and make sure to integrate that. But that is something that is effortful for me.
What have you learned about creating intentional relationships from the start?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think so. I'm about 18 months-ish into my job at SHRM Foundation. And I feel like I'm in a very different and much healthier place in terms of my interpersonal relationships with basically everyone in my professional life, because they don't have 20 years of me growing into the kind of understanding of how I needed to mask, as you say, my interactions. So I have, from the moment that I've met all of these people, because I moved from one field into another, I have been very conscious about engaging the way that I have learned how to engage, which I don't think of as a negative at all. I mean, sometimes I'm in conversations with folks and they say things like, "Oh, that must be so hard," or whatever. And it's not really that it's hard. It is that it is something I have to think about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like something I have to think about the way that I'm left-handed and I have to think about using right-handed scissors, right? Like, that's just the way the world is. And you can be upset about it or not. But like, I have learned, I think, to bring the positive aspects of my neurodivergence to bear in a really strong way. I have worked with our staff and our accounting team to create a completely new way of tracking our accounting that is making it possible for us to do all sorts of nuanced stuff. I've been put in charge of developing and structuring a complicated set of inputs and outputs to create an evaluation and impact measurement structure for the foundation that we've never had.
Wow.
I ran a very complicated structuring of like a 10-part partnership to create a bunch of work and a novel technology, because those are the places that I excel, is in essentially problem solving and process mapping and things like that. And what comes along with that is a lot of interpersonal dynamics that I have to pay attention to. But I think in the level of care that I have learned to bring to them, it actually makes them richer. And I think people value working with me. You know, I get comments about how people appreciate that when I get involved in a process, everything calms down and everything becomes logical and everything starts moving. And I feel like that's my neurodivergence coming in. So it's nice to own that as a positive contribution, because as I was saying earlier, I spent a lot of time judging myself. One of the other Post-its on my desk says, "Look at yourself with curiosity, not judgment." And I have been trying really hard to do that, to say, what is it that is a strength about this thing that I'm experiencing right now?
Oh, so hard to do. It's funny, as you were saying that, I was reflecting that I think part of the reason when we talked on the bus, I really wanted to have you on. I'm like, you just explained stuff to me and it felt so clear and simple. And I thought, gosh, this is it. And I honestly, I could see, I've never worked with you, but I could see that being very true. There's just a level of sort of calm, logical framework making that is very helpful.
hmm I mean, for my whole life, like if I think about a positive defining characteristic of the way that I see the world, I think of it as taking chaos and turning it into order.
Huh.
And that's like a natural thing for me. And when I was growing up, I think back now to how my parents would talk to me. And one of the things they would say to me all the time is, "You run so fast to the answer that sometimes you need to be patient and wait for everyone else to catch up to it rather than telling them what the answer is." I think that's really true. And where it's a positive for me is when I'm given opportunities, I can structure systems fairly quickly in ways that sometimes take other people more time. And where it shows up negatively and where I've had to learn is that I have to bring people with me.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it doesn't work because I'm past the stage of my career where the problems I'm trying to solve are the type of problems you can solve as one person.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
From the minds of visionaries to the desks of disruptors, I'm Lars Schmidt, host of the Redefining Work podcast. Join me each week as we explore the new world of work through the lens of those shaping it. CEOs, HR leaders, investors, and more. Be a part of the conversation that changes everything. Subscribe to Redefining Work today.
You've chosen, you're not an engineer, you're not a solo contributor. You have chosen to work for your career, as far as I've looked it up, in messy human drama, managing people.
Yeah. Well, managing people is something I fell into, but here's what I will
Okay.
say to the first part. So, in addition to being neurodivergent, I'm also very, very gay. And I grew up in a Connecticut town that was relatively Stepford-like. I didn't have an opportunity to come out until college. And then even then, it was really very hard because I, as you might imagine, given how black and white I am in lots of things, I had a very specific vision of where I was going, and it involved children, and it involved a sort of quote-unquote normal life. And
You wanted to be married and have children and
Yeah.
have that
Yeah.
steady, yeah.
And I am very lucky in that I met my husband in college, and we have
Wow.
been together since college.
Wow.
And he is the deepest, most patient man I could ever have possibly hoped to meet. And he has helped me to navigate the moments when I, for example, was treating him really poorly and not realizing it by naming it and letting me know that that's one of those parameters that I need to navigate. But in the course of that, as I was coming out, one of the main things that brought me out of the closet was being in the creative space. So I was in the theater community at my college. And I have never really left that creative space. I went from college into the arts. Given everything that I've talked about, it might not be surprising to learn that the thing within the arts that I wanted to do was be a director, which is to say control all the things.
Control everything.
And one of my quintessential, like, oh, wow, I am a little bit different experiences was when I directed my first show in college. At one point, my husband, who was my stage manager, literally told me that I was treating these humans like they were pieces on a chessboard and that I needed to cut it out.
Wow.
And it's true. And it was true. And it was really hard on those humans. And it is only through the grace of all of them and the fact that we were in this sort of melting pot of college that I ended up with lifelong friends instead of a bunch of folks who really thought I was very bad at directing.
Why? Because you were ordering them around? You were being careless?
Yeah, no, I was so like, I don't know if you know the play Equus. There's all sorts of layers in this story. So Equus is a play about possibly a disturbed kid who is possibly also gay, who becomes infatuated with horses, and all sorts of really dark stuff happens. It's a very, very good, very, very dark, very, very 1970s play.
70s. I was going to say very
Yeah.
70s. I can see
Yes.
the cover of the book that my parents had.
That is right. And so I directed that as a sophomore in college when I had no business doing so. And in my vision, it involved all 14 of the cast members staying on stage for the entirety of a 3.5-hour play. And half of them were wearing large ornamental metal horse heads for the entire time.
Oh, God. Good thing they weren't union.
Yes. So we don't have to get bogged down in that, but basically the creative space is where I found my heart home.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's where I went into, but I pretty quickly navigated out of the kind of creative part of the space and into the analytical part. So I moved from being a theater director into studying what it took to get people to care about arts and culture in the United States. and understanding the kind of neuropsychology of building empathy and interest in the creative arts. And eventually that transitioned into running a series of programs and services, developing enterprise technologies that were all designed to help people understand and make connections to arts and culture from wherever they were sitting. So you're interested in the state of the roads in your community? Well, here's a bunch of studies about arts and culture and the role that it can play in road safety. Or you're really worried about the education of your children. Here is all of the pile of information about education and the arts and the role that arts plays in helping improve, educational outcomes, things like that. And so in that way, I guess you're right. I've spent my time in sort of like a very messy, deeply human space. And perhaps that's why I have now moved into a very different space, which is all around kind of workforce development and expanding opportunity, but specifically through the lens of helping employers with their policies and practices.
Yeah.
But I think I find myself on the analytical edge of all of that messy space in a way that makes me really happy. I have a kind of creative soul. And then on top of that, I have this overlay of this like deeply analytical body.
That's a gift.
I mean, so far it's been great, in terms of navigating the kind of professional space. I've had much more success than I ever thought I would, and then on the personal front, I think, I'm now a dad. I have a 13-year-old. My husband and I have been married for 17 years. And I think that I've managed to really be very nestled and comfortable in that personal environment as well, in part because they embrace me for all of who I am and they help me understand when the thing that I'm being at that moment is maybe a little bit more than what they can take, and I need to like think about what's happening.
Oh, we all need that person.
Mm-hmm.
I find that as I get middle-aged, my neurodivergence pops up in really weird ways that it didn't used to. Like I have a lot more tools, but I also find myself feeling more and more eccentric and yet feeling like I'm much more at peace with it.
I guess I wouldn't say that I feel like mine is coming up in more ways, but I do feel like I notice all of the ways it comes up more. I would definitely agree, though, that it's not even that I care less about it, it's that I understand it to be part of who I am now in a different way. I mean, because you and I had a lot of deep conversation, I can talk someone's ear off. I inherited my dad's gift for gab. The joke at his memorial service was that there were no strangers, just friends he hadn't met yet. And that was very much my dad. And so I can do that, but I hit a wall, and it's a very, very hard wall when I hit it. I remember very clearly in my last job, I was on a fundraising trip with our head of fundraising in New York City. And we had been doing funder meetings in person for like 5 hours. And we exited one and we got in a cab to go to the next one. And I just slumped against the side of the cab and put my head against the window. And the head of development knew enough about me to know that what needed to happen was for the duration of that cab ride, I needed to acknowledge no one. And then I could turn it back on and it would be fine. But, I think that's a version of introversion and extroversion, sure. But I think it seems and feels to me like a more aggressive form. And it also means that like I need to go outside and be by myself sometimes. And, there were moments when my daughter was younger where like I would get home with her from childcare and my husband knew that what I needed to do was go upstairs and lay flat on my back for a half hour, and that I was really sorry that I was having to like abdicate my parenting responsibilities for a half hour, but I just couldn't not. And luckily he was able to embrace that and understand it and whatever. So all of that is part of me. I think what I struggle with a little bit is what is changeable in it and what's not, which I guess is the kind of theme of my whole life. I spent a lot of time thinking that my sexuality was changeable. I spent a lot of time thinking that the way I was interacting with people was changeable and I could become more. And I think what's changed for me now, if anything, is that I understand that I am who I am. And it's not that I don't burnish the edges of that, but I don't try and fundamentally change who I am for people anymore, because I just know after 43 years it's not going to happen. So they got to figure out how to like me for the version I can present to them, or not,
Or
you
not.
know? Yeah.
And I would imagine that takes a lot of the anxiety away.
It does. In a lot of circumstances, it definitely does. I still have, it's funny, I don't know how this is for you. I have certain personality types that bring out 100% of my anxiety,
Oh, yes.
because they seem to trigger every single one of my little tics
Uh-huh.
that can cause issues. And it like heightens my anxiety in various ways, and ends up with me, in a lot of cases, sort of behaving in the unmasked version of myself that comes across really badly. But I think in my previous career, that was really hard, because when I came across those folks in a professional setting, I didn't really have a lot of mechanisms for dealing with it.
Hmm.
And I think I've gotten better at it now, but it's definitely still not perfect. And what I have had to do was sort of rely on allies, people who are managing me, or people who are laterally at my same level, who I can sort of let know I'm struggling, and they can take more of the brunt of the engagement with that person.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that. I don't think we've ever talked about this on The Anxious Achiever, and yet it has struck me as so true.
It,
I find also I'm triggered by types of people I meet at work who had triggered me in high school and middle school. So I always had a real anxiety against popular girls who seemed so normal. And when I meet types at work, even though I'm almost 50, for God's sake, and then I find myself talking too much and being too much, like almost like I'm trying to prove something.
Yep.
And then it all gets out of hand.
Yeah.
And then I
Yeah.
leave and I spend hours worrying about what a bad impression I made, or God, I shouldn't have said that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. And I think, I guess the other thing I would say about anxiety is that I still second guess myself all the time.
Mm.
And I have things that are, I will say, bad habits that I know are bad habits that I do anyway. Right before this call, I was in the middle of doing something, and my husband came in to ask me a question. And I turned and engaged with him for a while, but then I started getting anxious about the thing that I had been in the middle of. But I didn't want to tell my husband to stop talking to me, because that felt rude.
Right.
So instead, in a thing that I've repeated often in my relationship with him, and that I know he hates and I know I'm not good at, I started working again while trying to listen to him. And it went the way that you would think it would go. And luckily he's a very forgiving person. It's all fine. But in the aftermath of that, I was sitting here not having finished the work thing, just obsessing over how problematic what I had done was. And I ended up having to go down, talk to him, and give him a hug and be like, I'm really sorry. And he was like, it's really fine. I don't know why you're doing this. So I ramp myself up about those moments where I feel like the way that I'm behaving that feels very natural to me obviously is not coming off well to the other person, but I don't realize it until it's done.
Mm-hmm.
And that person has signaled to me in fairly obvious ways that what I've done is less than what was needed. I imagine that's true for everyone, but it certainly still manifests for me, particularly around all of these things that I do that I think other folks would sort of know better than to do.
I think you're giving too much credit to other folks. I mean, I really do. I think that sometimes when you're self-aware and you've done all the work and you've been through it all, you're overly sensitive, which is a wonderful thing as a manager, but you put a lot of pressure on yourself, right?
Yeah.
Like you hold yourself to a really high standard of being, when the truth is most people are bumbling through life and acting out stuff all the time and not noticing either, whether they're on the spectrum or not. So it's like, I think it's interesting, like those of us who have sort of really, really put in the work and who really care about trying to whatever being better means to us, like maybe just give yourself a little bit of a break. Everyone's a jerk sometimes.
Well, I mean, you've just, that's a speech my therapist could have given me for sure.
Oh,
right?
good.
I
See,
never
and
give
one's
myself
free.
a break for anything,
No. No, of course not.
Yeah.
That's funny. You never give yourself a break.
No, I don't. I mean, I try more now, but as I said, I got these ex Post-its, and 3 of them are different ways of telling me to go easy on myself.
I do want to just touch on your work at the SHRM Foundation because you are looking at HR professionals and their mental health.
Yeah.
I would love to just hear what my audience needs to know about where HR professionals are at and you're a researcher. What's interesting to you right now?
So SHRM Foundation is the nonprofit arm of SHRM. And SHRM is the largest professional society for HR folks in the world. It has 340,000 members. And the foundation, our work is specifically focused on making sure that HR professionals have what they need to be agents for social good. One of the ways that we do that is by focusing on the mental health of HR professionals themselves, because they are at the fulcrum point of basically every type of stressor in the world of work, right? So they're the ones who have to deal with compliance issues. They have to deal with hirings and firings. They have to deal with the care of other people, the traumas that are experienced on a day-to-day basis, both inside and outside the world of work, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so within that, we have commissioned some research that came out earlier this year, and then have just produced and released about a month ago, actually at the same event where we met, Maura, an explainer for HR professionals on how they can take care of themselves first. Because the research that we commissioned basically revealed that, like many other caregivers of all types and stripes in the United States, HR professionals are really good at telling other people how to care for themselves and really bad at taking their own advice. And so, the explainer covers basic things like get enough sleep, eat well, but then it also moves into sort of how to become trauma informed so that you can engage with people who are having the sort of traumatic experiences that happen to all of us at some point without necessarily absorbing all of that trauma and carrying it home with you, where it can become a significant burden on you over time. Our goal is to address some trends that are really present in the HR field now, where recent data shows that HR professionals are not in a great mentally healthy space. There's data from SHRM that says that just over half of them wouldn't recommend becoming part of the HR profession to anyone who has mental health issues. And about 81% of them are experiencing some level of burnout at any given time. And about 2 in 3 are actively looking for jobs outside of the HR field.
Really?
And so that's not good. That's not a way to create a sustainable fulcrum point for the world of work. And so we are investing in different tools and resources, including with One Mind at Work, that will specifically help HR professionals to take those steps that they need to take advantage of the benefits that they've actually set up.
Last question. We were just laughing a few minutes ago about how it's really hard to give ourselves a break, right? To not always be wanting to do more, worrying about the next. Are we measuring up? What have you learned? You said you're getting better at taking a break.
Yeah.
What's your advice for burnt out people listening?
Here's what I will say. There is nothing like being laid off from a job that you thought you were a rock star at to make you question everything about the structure of your priorities and where you're spending your time. And coming out of that, had about 6 months of navigating the job market, but also taking a break and taking a breather for the first time since I was 21. And I came up with a few things that I didn't want to be doing the way that I'd been doing them for the past 20 years. And that included things like I really didn't want to be working from home all the time at night and on the weekends. I didn't want my job to revolve around work in the way that I had allowed it to revolve around work. And that's a habit that my husband and I both got into when we didn't have a kid. And then we suddenly had a kid and I was still doing it that way. And it just meant that I was not as present as a father as I wanted to be. I wasn't as present as a husband as I wanted to be. You don't turn that switch off overnight. So I still do some work. And so it is another thing that I have to sort of focus on. But it makes me much happier. And I guess the other thing that came out of that break for me was how important it was for me to get outside and to be in nature, even if nature is like the little tiny park that's across from my office at SHRM. And so I went from literally never scheduling, let alone taking a lunch break for like 10 years, to having a dedicated lunch break every day where most days I make myself go outside and I eat outside. And maybe I can only handle it for like 15 minutes. And then I'm like, I really just got to get back in and work. But it's something. And I find that it makes me feel healthier and feel more at peace, and also keeps my priorities at least a little bit closer to the right order for what I think is necessary for me at this time in my life, without any judgment on anyone else. You know, my 20-year-old self is looking at me going, what do you mean you stopped working at 5:00? And that's okay, because I had a lot more energy back then and a deep passion for what I was doing. And that's where I wanted to put all that passion. But now I want to put my passion into living my best life with my husband and my daughter, enjoying the beautiful place where I get to live, and being happy with all of the things that all that hard work has made possible for me now.
That's it for this episode of The Anxious Achiever. The show is produced and edited by Mary Dew, with production support and sound engineering by Nick Krinko. If you like what you heard, head to your favorite podcast app, leave us a review. It really matters, and we appreciate the time and effort it takes. And if you don't subscribe or follow the show already, now's the time. And let us know what you'd like to hear more of. I get some of my best ideas from my listeners, so find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. You can find my weekly newsletter there as well. A big thanks to LinkedIn and all the listeners out there and our guests in the Anxious Achiever world. Until next time.